Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico. Hey, before we talk about anything, I have to tell you three things, listeners. And we're going to talk about these things for a long time, so you have to just get used to it and deal with the idea that there's a little bit of some advertising in this podcast. But the advertising is for us, so you don't even need to worry about it. Okay, here's the first thing. You can pre-order the Magnificast book now if you want to. And you do want to. We've been talking about it forever, five-ever even, and you can go to our website and pre-order it. You can find the pre-order link at tinyurl.com/Magnificast pre-order. You can look it up on the Fortress Press website. If you just Google the Magnificast book, you can find it for sure. The book is called Enough is Enough, Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. Three things that people listening to this podcast are interested in. And I think, as you'll remember, we did a lot of episodes where we said, oh, this is going to be in the book. This thing is going to be in the book too. This idea is in the book. And then none of them were. They all got cut out. So you don't know what's in this book. It's all a secret. Everything you think you know about this book, you don't know. You're gonna flip your lid when you read it. It's gonna be so cool. Dean, what do you have to say about this book?
Yeah, even I don't know what's in it. We spent so much time writing it. It's hard to say what made it into the book and what didn't, but I think it's good. We're getting some endorsements back, and I guess we'll share those when we have permission to do it. And other people also think it's good, so that's a good sign. I taught a bunch of it. I taught the drafts of it in a class this summer, and the people who participated in that class liked the book or were at least too afraid of my domineering professorial authority to say they didn't like it. Either way, I'm fine with it. I think it's cool, and I'm excited to see what people think about it. Like you said, we're going to say 100 other things about it in the future, but go pre-order it. You can get it wherever, but I feel like you should tell your library to get it. That's a good socialist institution. And you can get it from your local bookstore. And I guess we'll see what people think. It comes out May 12 officially, so we've still got a while yet, but you can pre-order it now.
Wherever you do pre-order it, you can afterwards go to Amazon and then say it's really good on Amazon, but don't buy it from them. I know that's confusing. Right. That's confusing instruction, but do not buy it from them, but do tell them it's great. Okay, besides the book, you can also join the ongoing, newly restarted Magnificast reading group. We're reading The Long Heat by Wim Carton and Andreas Malm, a really scary book about climate change and adaptation and lots of other things. Yeah, we just started this past Sunday evening, and we're going to be doing another reading group about the second half of the book in 2 weeks. So join in at patreon.com/the Magnificast, and then there's a Discord channel you can kind of join about the book and learn all about it. Have a good chat about an interesting book that's really scary that makes me stay awake at night thinking about climate change. And then finally, we also have a new zine that you can go check out. If you go to the Magnificast website, just Google the Magnificast. Don't even worry about the website. There's a section at the top on the top bar that's called zines, and we have two zines. One's about Cuba, and the other one is about Gerard Winstanley, and it features The True Leveler's Standard Advance. It's a cool zine. Dean worked really hard on it, and I worked a little bit on it, but not very much. And it's great. Go there and get it for free and show your friends, and think about all of your favorite Chumbawamba inspired soundtrack you can listen to as you read it.
That's right. We'll probably make another zine or two in the coming months, in part to keep promoting this degrowth book. So keep your eyes peeled on social media and everywhere else, and you can find them there. Okay, here's a good segue. We're talking about our zines, but let me tell you something. There's a new papal zine out, everybody. That is basically what an apostolic exhortation is. It's a big papal zine. It's not quite an encyclical. It's not quite like an address or a homily. It's in between. It's an apostolic exhortation. And Pope Leo the 14th, he's got a new one out called Dilexi Te. It is a sequel to Pope Francis's final encyclical, which was called Dilexit Nos. And this is sort of like I was going to say papal tradition, but I don't know how many times it's happened. But it happened when Pope Francis took over from Pope Benedict. Benedict was in the middle of completing an encyclical, and then Pope Francis finished it off and released it. And same here. Pope Francis was writing this kind of follow-up to Dilexi Te, and then he sadly passed away. So Pope Leo stepped in and wrote the rest of it, or edited it, or who knows what state he found it in. But it's theirs. It's 2 popes, 1 zine, 1 exhortation. And I got to tell you, man, I'm feeling exhorted. I don't know about you, but it's a good exhortation about the love for the poor.
Big time. This came out a few weeks ago, and I read it on the train home from London, and I was really floored by the whole thing. Liberation theology plays a pretty prominent role in it, I would say. There's some very big aggressive nods towards liberation theology. I think it has a particular sort of place within this that maybe we haven't seen before, or at least not explicitly like this in a while. But it's a cool one. It is, as papal exhortations go, right up the alley of this podcast with regard to the poor and the structural causes for poverty. It's pretty wild. Dean, what's the Catholic world saying about it? I mean, I know what I'm saying, and I think it's cool, but is there a lot of buzz in Catholicism?
Yeah, there has been buzz. I think people want to psychologize Pope Leo, which is understandable. It's his first year as the Pope. Everybody wants to know what he's doing, what he thinks. And he's from the United States, and there's lots of opportunities for like figuring out and like decoding his secret message to MAGA Catholics, all these kinds of goofy things that people do on the internet. But I think more substantively than that, people are talking about this as a document of continuity, that Pope Leo is making sure that he is kind of pulling the thread that Pope Francis was already dangling out there for all of us to pull. I don't know, a weird metaphor, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. And I think that is a good sign. It's interesting because when Pope Francis took over from Benedict and kind of finished off what he was writing, you could sort of tell like where Benedict began and where Francis ended. And I mean, people debate this, but in my opinion, it was a lot of Benedict and not a lot of Francis. So we kind of had to wait. We had to wait for Pope Francis's first apostolic exhortation himself, Evangelii Gaudium, to really tell us like what's his flavor. And that might also be the case with this document. It's a very Pope Francis-y document. But there are some pieces in here that look like Pope Leo had a pretty strong intentional hand, and we'll maybe try to read between the lines and figure out where that voice might be emerging. But I think that it's a good sign, at least, that people in the Catholic world are noticing that this is a statement of continuity, and that is a good thing, I think, for folks who felt like Pope Francis was on the right track.
Yeah, cool. Tell me more about the trend of maybe reading this against the MAGA Catholicism types of things. That is, I mean, obviously that seems true just because of the things that this says, but it seems like reading it that way explicitly is like, this is an own against J.D. Vance particular. It seems so funny because this is like miles away from dealing with the discourse of U.S. politics. You know, this is about poverty and theology in a bigger way, and U.S. politics seems so like crude and stupid in light of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a kind of U.S. chauvinism, I don't know, in U.S. journalism, unsurprisingly, and that chauvinism appears not only in terms of like an America First MAGA ideology, but also in terms of just thinking that everything is kind of a sideways remark about the United States. And I think that is not good. It will lead you to overinterpret things or see things that aren't there. But I think it's fair to sort of wonder, like, Pope Leo is from the United States, and he had a history of at least being, as a bishop, publicly outspoken, as a cardinal, outspoken against the rightward trend of MAGA Catholicism and Vance in particular. So, you know, there's maybe like a little more credence to give to that sort of psychologizing than in other instances. But I agree that like to reduce the document to that, which is what a lot of commentators do or memes do or whatever, is to really miss out on what is structurally penetrating about it. Like it's a much deeper than a commentary on what Donald Trump is doing or what J.D. Vance is doing, because it's really a commentary about the global economic situation that we have. And that is the situation that the Democrats are happy to maintain. It's a situation that other progressive capitalist governments in the world are also happy to maintain. And I think the challenge of something like Dilexi Te is to say, well, it's not only so-called right-wingers who are going to feel called out by an authentic reading of this document. It's also the kind of defenders of the current liberal order who ought to feel like they're not measuring up. And the more that we reduce these kinds of documents to, I don't know, culture war politics or whatever, the more we also sort of let the liberal guardians of the current order off the hook. And I think that we should not do that. So it's important to read it, as you said, as like something that feels a lot deeper than, Vatican, Washington, tit for tats or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I did see a really good piece in the New Republic by Katie Kalaidis. I don't know if I've said her last name right, and if she's listening, I'm so sorry. But she did write a cool piece for the New Republic called Pope Leo Declares Whose Side He's On, and it's not J.D. Vance's. And to her credit, this article is not falling into that same trap that you were just talking about of sort of like, just being sort of reducing Dilexi Te to the culture war or something. I think that it's giving a lot more interesting analysis about liberation theology. For example, in this article, she says, for Dilexi Te, which means I have loved you, it marks the triumph of liberation theology, once derided and maligned by the Western Catholic establishment as now essential part of papal teaching, which is a really strong way to put it, and I think is right in a lot of ways, as we'll see. J.D. Vance aside, I think the liberation theology takes are good, and highlighting that piece is good. So, some of the journalism is, always going to not be great, but some of it is good.
Some of it is good. And I guess to her credit, most journalists don't pick their own headlines. And for whatever reason, the New Republic specifically has decided that it's just going to do boomer clickbait titles for every article now. So
that's true.
That's not her fault.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a lot to say about liberation theology with respect to this document specifically. And I'm going to offer a challenge to the both of us to wait until the end of the episode, and then we're going to specifically quarantine a whole section to talk about liberation theology, because I think if we start now, we're going to miss all the other stuff in the document, and then we're going to end up reducing this document to liberation theology document, which also probably we shouldn't do. So that's the challenge. We may or may not meet it, but do you agree to these terms, Matt?
I will do, I solemnly swear to do everything in my power not to talk about liberation theology until the last bit of this episode.
That's great. Okay, so let's get into the document. It is a document about poverty, and broadly construed, Pope Francis was writing it at the end of his life, and he had said that he was working on something about the poor. And I think that's really exciting because Pope Francis choosing the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, he obviously had poverty and the poor close to his heart, and he reflects on poverty in many, many documents, but he doesn't really have he didn't have a papal document like this speaking specifically about poverty. And I think that is kind of neat to at least get these are his parting words, his last song, just really giving it to us in a clear and clarified way. And as I said, maybe we'll try to parse out where Leo is coming in to sing some harmonies. Just a lot of metaphors in this podcast today. But let me get your first hot take, Matt. You're riding home on the train from London. What do you think about this big document?
Wow. What do I think? Okay. My hot take is this. Everything in here is nice. And it's just Christians should think about the poor. They should think about how to encounter God through sort of acts of charity and acts of solidarity. And that's all extremely cool. And that is my thing for sure. I love that. A great challenge to me and every other person in the entire world reading this, because it's a hard thing to think about. All that's great. I think there's also some times where the Pope is letting the church off the hook for kind of creating the situation of capitalism in the first place and enabling poverty and violence towards indigenous people and women and everybody else. So anyways, my hot take is that this is all great stuff, and this is a great prophetic word for the church, but maybe we shouldn't forget that maybe we are also very guilty in all of this.
Yeah, that's true. It can be a little bit of a Tim Robinson wearing the hot dog costume
Yeah.
when you read the Pope complaining about all kinds of things. But yeah, I think what is interesting about the kind of prophetic voice here is that we're getting at least an aspirational vision of what the church ought to think about poverty. And in that respect, it pushes against a lot of assumptions that we still have in especially a neoliberal global order. And I thought maybe that would be, at least those are the things that stuck out to me quite a lot. Like there are so many places in the document where Pope Leo and Francis are sort of identifying like how people think about poverty and poor people and why people are poor and all these kinds of things, and just really like clearly rejects the kind of neoliberal stories about, you know, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or kind of blaming people for their own station in life and all that kind of stuff. So that really stuck out to me. We could pull out some examples of that in a minute. The other thing that really stuck out to me structurally, and this is where I wonder if this is the Leo stamp, but you never know. There's a section in here that's basically just like a history of like a potted history of what the church, like church fathers and others have said about poverty and about wealth. And Pope Leo he's an Augustinian. He comes from the Augustinian order. If you look at his other writings as Pope so far, or statements or speeches, he clearly has an investment in not only Augustinian writing and language and spirituality, but in the tradition of the like late ancient or early medieval kind of mendicant spirituality that his order comes from. And that I thought was also really fascinating. So you get this like deconstruction of neoliberalism and this deeper traditional thinking about poverty. And I feel like that makes for a pretty strong intervention.
Yep. In this, you get all kinds of stuff about Augustine, you get John Chrysostom, you get St. Francis, you get the Church in Acts, you get James, the brother of Jesus Christ, all kinds of great guys in the early church who were, who had things to say about poverty. Very cool. A real who's who of early church people talking about poverty in this thing.
A real who's who of wealth haters.
That's right. Well, we'll get to some of that, I guess, in a minute. I don't know, Dean, how should we go through this big document? It's not that long, I guess, but what's the plan of attack here?
That's a great question. Well, for the listener, maybe we can pull the curtain back here. And I feel like that honesty is the best policy, really. Matt and I have each identified a handful of pieces or sections that we thought were interesting and put them all in a big document that is poorly organized. And I think the best way for us to do it is maybe just to go through and identify those parts that we find especially interesting and important. And we can just pull them out of the hat like a big grab bag of cool stuff to talk about until later on I'll say, and now is the time to talk about liberation theology. So whatever you find in there is great. But if you do find a chip that says liberation theology, you have to throw it back in the hat.
Okay. I will do my best. Okay, this is one that I pulled out from the very beginning. This is something I think I tweeted about when I was on the train home. This is thesis number 11 from this big document.
Section. You can use section.
Okay, I'm sorry, not thesis. This is not Karl Marx. This is a section. All right. The Pope writes, a concrete commitment to the poor must also be accompanied by a change in mentality that can have an impact at the cultural level. The illusion of happiness derived from a comfortable life pushes many people towards a vision of life centered on the accumulation of wealth and social success at all costs, even at the expense of others and by taking advantage of unjust social ideals and political economic systems that favor the strongest. In a world where the poor are increasingly numerous, we paradoxically see the growth of a wealthy elite living in a bubble of comfort and luxury, almost in another world compared to ordinary people. This means that a culture still persists, sometimes well disguised, that discards others without even realizing, and tolerates indifference that millions of people die of hunger or survive in the conditions unfit for human beings. Okay, I pulled this out because it definitely has a degrowth slant to it that I do like. The illusion of happiness derived from a comfortable life is definitely a degrowth idea. But I appreciate this because it's not just about the existence of real poverty, but it's also about the weird ideology of capitalism that persists, that says, if we can be happy if we just have like sort of this type of particular like capitalist life, especially in the United States or in the global north, maybe more broadly, a life that does definitely like rely on the labor and extraction of profits from people in the global south. So anyways, I thought it was a pretty prescient bit of analysis. It's not just poverty. It's also that like we want this particular type of life that's been sold to us, the illusion of happiness. So very cool. And true even. How great.
Yeah, extremely cool. Also good to tie the accumulation of wealth. That's kind of like a goal in itself that naturally creates problems and pulls people away from their encounter with others. A lot of great degrowth material in here. That's for book 2. Enough is enough too, not enough. I don't know what we'll call it yet, but yeah, I think that there's a lot of kind of challenging thoughts for a world patterned around economic capitalist growth. And maybe to return to this bit about challenging neoliberalism on the flip side of all that, the thing about living a comfortable life is when you're alienated from the poor, you can end up having all kinds of very silly ideas about poverty. And not too long after that, in section 14, the popes, I'll say, because who knows who actually wrote this part, they say, the poor are not there by chance or by blind and cruel fate, nor for most of them is poverty a choice. Yet there are those who still presume to make this claim, thus revealing their own blindness and cruelty. Of course, among the poor, there are also those who don't want to work, perhaps because of their ancestors who worked all their lives died poor. I think that is an awesome point, by the way. Just being like, you don't want to work because, like, what's the point? However, there are so many others, men and women, who nonetheless work from dawn to dusk, perhaps collecting scraps or the like, even though they know that their hard work will only help them to scrape by, but never really improve their lives. Nor can it be said that most of the poor are such because they do not deserve otherwise, as maintained by that specious view of meritocracy that sees only the successful as deserving. So I really think it's an impressive deconstruction of those goofy ideas people have about the poor. But it's one that also really gives the poor, I guess, like, the word agency is too, like, liberal coded nowadays. But it gives the poor, like, I don't know, a sense of, like, rationality behind what neoliberals end up interpreting either as irrationality or as, like, a choice that kind of like removes them from considerations of like social good. So I think especially the kind of no one wants to work anymore sentiment, the idea that like, well, some people probably don't want to work anymore because that's not really going to advance you. And even the people who work very hard don't end up, socially mobile. They're just like surviving. That is something we see a lot in Pope Francis. And it's an idea that I think is really important for the church to recover. In Evangelii Gaudium, there's another really interesting section where Pope Francis talks about violence. And the wording he uses there is the poor are accused of violence. And then he kind of like calls to mind how much inequality just kind of like naturally spawns violence, and how securitization of societies doesn't actually create peace and doesn't resolve violence. And I feel like there's just a real commitment on Pope Francis's part, and hopefully on Pope Leo's as well, to try to like give the poor the benefit of the doubt or the benefit of having faith in them or whatever. And that is such a like countercultural move.
Yeah, that is very cool. Speaking of nobody wants to work anymore, there is actually a section right before that sorry, maybe this is a good transition into. In section 12, he says, this stuck out to me because of the degrowth conversation as well, and maybe it'll be clear in a second why. But the Pope's right. We must not let our guard down when it comes to poverty. We should be particularly concerned about the serious conditions in which many people find themselves due to a lack of food and water. In wealthy countries too, the growing numbers of poor are equally a source of concern. And he goes on to cite a few things about poverty in places like Europe, and such a good point, because sometimes the like, you know, the connotations of poverty and these conversations around global poverty, they center on the global south, which is, I think, right, because that's where extraction happens, and, you know, all kinds of accumulation happens there at the expense of poor and like working people, so that makes sense. But I think drawing attention to poverty in wealthy countries is actually really important, because it demonstrates the ways that even in like the centers of empire and the centers of capitalist accumulation, poverty still exists, because that's just what capitalism does, right? It needs cheap labor to buy, and it needs cheap labor to produce things to sell, even if it's something like hamburgers or whatever. So really quickly, just, poverty is a problem everywhere for sure. But in the United States, where probably a lot of people who listen to this podcast live, it is also a poverty. Sorry, it is also a problem. I did a quick search on my favorite website, the Economic Policy Institute, which is which is a lib organization for sure. They're not like communists or whatever. They're just like progressives, and, you know, good for them doing economics and stuff. Anyways, there are two articles I thought were really interesting that they published recently that I thought were worth bringing up. One is about the state income and poverty data from the 2024 census, which demonstrates that since 2019, from 2019 to 2024, the median income has increased a bit. However, there are some states where it has not, and they have this cool interactive map that will show you on the Economic Policy Institute website which states that poverty is growing the quickest. And Washington D.C., not a state. We all know that, I guess. To the deficit of Washington D.C., they should maybe be a state. I don't know. I'm not a part of that conversation. But anyways, the poverty rate is growing the fastest there between 2019 and 2024, which is very interesting. So poverty in Washington D.C. grew by 3.8%. And it went up in other places too, especially the states that you would kind of guess it would go up in, like southern states, like maybe like West Virginia, where poverty rose a little bit. But then other states, even the liberal ones, the poverty rate has increased, like in places like New York or Minnesota. All very interesting. But then I did also dust off my previous sort of Fight 15 hat, and I was like wondering what was going on with the minimum wage in the United States. And the federal minimum wage still has not gone up since 2009, so that's more than 15 years, which is crazy. But the value of the minimum wage in the United States has fallen by 30%, so it's worth less than it ever has before. So they have a nice chart that says in 2025, the federal minimum wage is under the poverty line for any household size. So no matter how many people live in your house, even if you're only one person, you cannot survive on the federal minimum wage. There's a nice little bar graph that says that the minimum wage for a full-time year-round person of one person in the household, you're the only person that lives with you, is $15,080, which is wild and not enough money, obviously. I don't know. It seems like worth pulling these things out, because I hate the idea that poverty seems like a far off exotic problem that doesn't exist in the United States or something. Because, you know, sometimes in the degrowth conversations or other types of socialist conversations, you know, you get the idea that the United States is very well off and very wealthy country, which is very true, but that does not stop people from being extremely impoverished in this extremely wealthy country, one of those great contradictions of capital. So anyways, just a minor point that I've rambled on about for quite a bit of time now, but the Pope is paying attention to that fact as well. He's noted it down in his big book, and he's got it covered, and we should think about it too, that poverty exists sort of internationally. A simple point, but an important one.
That's right. Actually, this is also kind of tangentially related, but important. The World Meeting of Popular Movements, which the Vatican convened 4 times under Pope Francis, they met again, and this time with Pope Leo for the first time. So lots of your faves are already there. The MST, the Landless Workers in Brazil, they were there. Pax Christi, like the Catholic Nonviolent organization, they were there. Lots of people were there. And Pope Leo had an address And these addresses that Pope Francis would give to this meeting were always like some of the places of the best quotes. The moments when Pope Francis let himself be particularly radical. And Leo, I'll say, is maybe not as like fiery as Pope Francis, but he has his own way of putting things. And one thing that was interesting is in his final statement for this meeting, he calls attention to the United States' fentanyl epidemic as a way of being like, isn't it so wild that even in a country like the US, they're still like struggling with this incredibly bad situation? And I think that there is something to that that's kind of interesting. Like, Pope Leo seems uniquely positioned to kind of bridge the North Gap discussion on a lot of these nuances, and I hope that he leans into that. I feel like that is an important role for the Pope in particular.
If we're going to talk about the ideology of capitalism, the one that tells us that we want this like kind of comfortable life that is built off the extraction of resources by other people's labor, I think we need to confront even, the way that we think about poverty, the way that we think about addiction, and the way that we think about, just the ways that capitalism works us over, that it does affect all of us. I think that's great because if poverty is just like a problem in another country, then it's a matter of, international politics and so on. But if poverty is something that happens to even people in the United States, then it is something that's kind of thrust into your zone of vision and experience. You have to deal with poverty where you live, and that like the causes of poverty around the world, though they are different in intensity and quality, they are caused by the same system. So it seems worth figuring out.
Definitely. All right, we're moving on because we're running out of time, and I'm gonna have to ring the big liberation theology bell soon. There's a bunch of other stuff, and we can talk about all of it. One thing I wanted to pull out, because we've been on this theme on the show lately, is a series of sections about monasticism that I thought were pretty interesting. It starts in section 53 and then goes forward for a little while, but I'll just read the beginning because I think it's pretty neat. He says, they say, monastic life, which originated in the silence of the desert, was from the outset a witness to solidarity. Monks and nuns left everything, wealth, prestige, family, not only because they despised worldly goods, contemptus mundi, but also to encounter the poor Christ in this radical detachment. St. Basil the Great, in his rule, saw no contradiction between the monk's life of prayer and contemplation and their work on behalf of the poor. For him, hospitality and care for the needy were an integral part of monastic spirituality, and monks, even after having left everything to embrace poverty, had to help the poorest with their work, because in order to have enough to help the needy, he's quoting here, it is clear that we must work diligently. This way of life is profitable not only for subduing the body, but also for charity towards our neighbor, so that through us God may provide enough for our weaker brothers and sisters. He says a bunch of other stuff about how like that sort of idea motivated, like constructing these big institutions around like healthcare and education, lots of other stuff too. But I thought that was such a kind of, I don't know, cool way to talk about monastic spirituality. As we talked about a few weeks ago, the stereotype of monasticism is that it's this retreat from the world and you're kind of not concerned with what's going on out there, and you're also just like living a kind of like perpetual bummer, like a life of austerity. But the monastic spirituality you get in Pope Francis and Pope Leo as well is this sort of direct connection between the retreat on the one hand from certain aspects of the world, namely wealth, privilege, those kinds of connections. And that retreat actually allows you to encounter the world in a more radical way, kind of detached from all that stuff. So anyway, I thought since we've been on the degrowth monasticism train lately, it was good to pull that out. He talks a bit also, unsurprisingly, about the mendicants, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and this kind of like spirituality of encounter that kind of comes along with all that, which is very neat. But anyway, cool to see that like emerging theology of monastic solidarity coming out here.
Yeah, definitely. Very cool. A great piece. And there's so much in this that we're not going to talk about. It's dawning on me. But maybe before we switch, before you ring the big liberation theology bell, Let's really quickly talk about the James 5 part because I really liked it. We're always talking about James 5 on this podcast. If you're unfamiliar, open up a Bible or Google James 5, and you get a really great warning to rich people, it's a good one. Anyways, in this sort of in the section where the popes are addressing some of like the historical basis of thinking about poverty in the church, they turn to James, where I'll just read the bit here. It's section 30. They say, James goes on to say, "Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you. It will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." Great James 5. We love it. We've read it so much on this podcast, and we'll read it again in the future. The bit that follows is very funny to me. These are powerful words, even if we'd rather not hear them. A similar appeal can be found in the first letter of John. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Another classic, another good one for the Christians on the left. But there's this great piece that follows about the church in Acts, kind of like figuring out some of these politics, maybe in practice, in sort of in a community, that I thought was like pretty powerful. So those are sections 30 and 31, and then 32. The popes chime in and say, "Indeed, we find a clear ecclesial example of sharing goods and caring for the poor in the daily life of the first Christian community. We can recall in particular the ways in which the question of the daily distribution of subsidies to widows was resolved. This was not an easy problem, partly because some of these widows who came from other countries were sometimes neglected because they were foreigners. In fact, the episode recounted in the Acts of the Apostles highlights a certain discontent on the part of the Hellenists, the Jews who were culturally Greek. The apostles do not respond with abstract words, but by placing charity towards all at the center, reorganizing assistance to widows by asking the community to seek wise and respected people to whom they would entrust their food distribution, while they take care of preaching the word." This part was really interesting to me because Pope Leo puts like the Acts of the Apostles, some of these church fathers, the church in Acts, all these kinds of things as something to imitate, something at the kind of core of the Christian story, emphasizing that faith that works is dead, a big Catholic vibe, which is great. But I like the bit at the end about the widows who came from different countries, who were foreigners too. I mean, it spirals out into a larger section he has about accompanying migrants, which is, I think, a really important thing to say in 2025, the year of our Lord, where migrants are like the most hated people on the planet. I was walking down my street just the other day and saw a sticker on a telephone pole that said "Stop the boats," and I took it off the telephone pole. Anyways, that's just one small act of the way that you can accompany migrants in the world is by taking down the racist stickers. But anyways, just like tying all of these things together in a really strong way that knits together the biblical tradition, the tradition of the early church, with sort of like a larger analysis around, global economics and politics. Very powerful. Lots of great things in this exhortation. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I feel like there's a real kind of gift in this exhortation of actually pulling together a bunch of weird stuff from Christian history about poverty that's pretty radical and keeping it all in one place. You mentioned there's some great stuff from the Bible in there. We talked about how he goes through the early church. There's some stuff on Chrysostom, on St. Augustine, on a bunch of others. One thing that I thought I wanted to pull out, though, is a really interesting interpretation that happens in the beginning of the document, where you kind of see how one of the big sort of like points of this exhortation is to say the preferential option for the poor is at the heart of how we understand everything. Like, we can look through the tradition of the church and sort of pull out a thread. We can look through the Bible and pull out a thread. These kind of things that feel really essential, but maybe we lose if we don't have poverty at the front of our brains. And they demonstrate this with a pretty interesting reading of a passage that I had never thought before. were never identified before. So this is in sections 4 and 5. He's talking about the story where a woman pours oil on Jesus's head, and all the disciples are complaining about it. And then Jesus says, you always will have the poor with you, but you will not always have me," which is the verse in Matthew 26 that a lot of like conservative Christians will cite to say that's why you don't have to care about the poor or don't care about social justice, because, you know, this is like a problem we'll have till the end of time. But the way that they work it out in this document, I think, is really impressive. So here's how they put it. "That woman saw in Jesus the lowly and suffering Messiah, on whom she could pour out all her love. What comforting that anointing must have brought to the very head that within a few days would be pierced by thorns. It was a small gesture, of course, but those who suffer know how great even a small gesture of affection can be, and how much relief it can bring. Jesus understood this and told the disciples that the memory of her gesture would endure. The simplicity of the woman's gesture speaks volumes. No sign of affection, even the smallest, will ever be forgotten, especially if it's shown to those who are suffering, lonely, or in need, as was the Lord at that time." And then he goes on to say, "Love for the Lord, then, is one with love for the poor. The same Jesus who tells us, 'The poor you will always have with you,' also promises the disciples, 'I am with you always.'" He goes on to say a lot more. But I think what's really fascinating here is that there's this like direct connection between poverty and Christ, which puts them together in, you know, one in the same category. So when the Bible is saying the poor you'll always have with you, when Jesus is saying that, it maps directly onto the reality that Jesus will also always be with you. So it's, rather than being like a pessimistic statement, I guess, about our inability to solve poverty, it's like an affirmation that the poor are the place where you encounter God, and that's a good thing. And he goes on to say, "This is not a matter of mere human kindness, but a revelation. Contact with those who are lowly and powerless is a fundamental way of encountering the Lord in history. In the poor, he continues to speak to us." I think there's like a danger in instrumentalizing the poor and making them a path to God instead of just being like, I don't know, people that you encounter. That can be also a very cringy thing that Christians do sometimes do. But I think that kind of like twist on "the poor you'll always have with you" as a passage, you know, it like shows the utility of a kind of exhortation like this that's trying to take poverty as like a hermeneutical principle by which we can, you know, maybe rediscover parts of the Gospels that we sort of tune out or turn off when we're locked in like the hellscape of capitalism.
That all sounds good. And Dean, I see your hand on the big liberation theology bell. You're about to ring it.
I'm gonna ring it.
I can see. I know that you're gonna just ring-a-ling-ling that bell. But before you do, if you think that this papal exhortation is great, if you are interested in the compilation of historical Christians and documents that have something to say about poverty, let me tell you about something else that you're going to really love, and that is a book that's called Enough is Enough, Decode Capitalism and Liberation Theology. You can pre-order this book now if you go to the Magnificast website. You can also just Google Enough is Enough, the Magnificast, any other search terms you can think of. You can get it on fortresspress.com. You can go to your local bookstore, ask them to buy it, or order it from them, or whatever, however you do that. You can also ask your library to just get a copy, which is ideal. Man, if we got some of these on library shelves, that would be some good stuff. A great book. It's 139 pages, but it's a 6x9 book, so deceptively big. It's a big chunky one. Anyways, Dean, do you want to ring the bell now?
Okay, if you're still with us after that brief commercial break, you will be rewarded now with the big buzzer that says Liberation Theology on it. You can't hear it, dear listener, because the sound technology of recording equipment is so good now that, you know, they don't let that kind of noise come through and disrupt the sweet cadence of our voices. But rest assured, it's going crazy over here. I can barely hear myself talk. It's saying Liberation Theology now over and over again. So I'm going to turn it off just for now so that we can have this conversation. The document has a lot of interesting things to offer in reflecting on the history and fate of liberation theology in the church. The document is like very subtly affirming of liberation theology in a way that I think is actually very brilliant. For people who don't know, liberation theology, it ran it afoul of the Vatican in a number of different ways. And the Vatican itself also felt compelled to first discipline liberation theologians, but then also kind of come around on a few issues. So the Vatican had issued 2 statements or, documents of teaching or writing or clarification, however you want to put it, about liberation theology, which had mixed reception among liberation theologians, as you could guess. But at the same time that whole process was kind of going on, one thing that made that like confrontation always a bit challenging for both the Vatican and the theologians was that already in the late 60s, in 1968, the bishops of Latin America had gathered in Medellin, Colombia, to have a big ecclesial conference. And in their conference, Gustavo Gutierrez and others were very significant voices kind of preparing the conference. And so liberation theology kind of like contributed a bunch of language to how the bishops were speaking, especially these concepts like a preferential option for the poor. We're talking about things like structural sin and so on. So because of that 68 Medellin document, there was already like kind of a flag in the sand for liberation theologians within the institutional church. A little bit later, there was another conference held in Puebla, Mexico. And that was also a political situation, and it was unclear what the fate of liberation theology would be. And in the end, it kind of came out with a bit of a compromise document, but one that clearly didn't discipline or rebuke liberation theology. And so those 2 conferences are kind of met as like the moments that liberation theology survived. And then beyond that, there were a couple others, one in San Domingo, one in Aparecida in Brazil. And Pope Francis himself was the principal, he was like the chair of the committee that drafted the final document of Aparecida in 2007, another Latin American Bishops' Conference document. And so, these conferences, they kind of are like mediating conversations between the Vatican and liberation theology in some ways. And over, liberation theologians kind of managed to like skate by. I mean, not without their casualties, right? Like Boff was silenced for a year. Cardinal was given an ultimatum, many others too. But on the whole, people like Gutierrez in particular had managed to like escape the worst of it. When Pope Benedict became the Pope, then people were like, okay, I guess that's the nail in the coffin on liberation theology, because he had been one of the most like dogged opponents of it. But when Pope Francis became Pope, he made this conscious effort to rehabilitate a lot of liberation theologians. And by the time you get to this document, to make all this stuff finally relevant, all this rambling actually matter, you can see throughout the popes, they cite those Latin American conferences very positively in multiple places, clearly cementing the kind of contributions of those conferences. And they also kind of double down on a lot of liberation theology language. But one thing that also comes out here is a kind of like subtle or not so subtle reference to a specific document. And I'll just read the section 98, and then Matt, we can talk more about it. They say, finally, in a document that was not initially well received by everyone, we find a reflection that remains timely today. It says, the defenders of orthodoxy are sometimes accused of passivity, indulgence, or culpable complicity regarding the intolerable situation of injustice and the political regimes which prolong them. Spiritual conversion, the intensity of the love of God and neighbor, zeal for justice and peace, the gospel meaning of the poor and poverty are required of everyone, and especially of pastors and those in positions of responsibility. The concern for the purity of the faith demands giving the answer of effective witness in the service of one's neighbor, the poor, and the oppressed in particular, in an integral theological fashion. This is document that it says is, was not well received by everybody, was the one that Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger, had written as an instruction on certain aspects of the theology of liberation in 1984. And as I said, it was not well received by both conservatives who felt like it should be more disciplinary. People wanted them to like condemn liberation theology, which, it stopped short of like saying this is heretical. And on the other hand, certain liberation theologians kind of welcomed it and then tried to figure out what to do with it. Leonardo Boff tried to do that in an admirable way, I think. And then others were like, this is, a total misunderstanding, a willful misunderstanding, etc. But what you can see with this kind of citation here is the Pope, like, very cleverly trying to, like, basically keep everybody together. So instead of having a wedge between liberation theology and the Vatican, the popes here are being like, let's pull all this stuff together, kind of bury the feud a little bit, and move forward with the contributions that liberation theology ultimately did make to theological discourse. So I don't know. I feel like it would be too strong to say that this is like the victory of liberation theology, or this is like a document of liberation theology, but it is definitely like a victory of liberation theology, and maybe like cements some of the most important contributions of Latin American liberation theology in particular to the like language of magisterial teaching. So I think that's definitely a pretty important development of this document.
Yeah, no, I agree. That seems interesting. And yeah, I think that analysis is correct. It makes me think of that one Kotsky piece that we always kind of return to over and over again. Longtime listeners, I'm sure will remember. But if you're not a longtime listener, that's okay. Karl Kotsky wrote this like very weird newspaper article kind of analyzing St. Francis as a bearer of like primitive communism within the church or something. No, or something. That's what the piece is arguing. And in it, Kotsky is like, identifying all of these sort of like proto-communist ideas that you get from somebody like St. Francis. Not only do you get the emphasis on poverty, but you get sort of like a newfound addition of working in common that's kind of interesting and different than just sort of like the primitive communism of the early Church of Acts or whatever. But at the end of the article, Kotsky's like, yeah, well then St. Francis, finally submitted to the Pope, and, the whole thing kind of failed. But the thing that Dean and I always talk about is like, well, I mean, is it really that much of a failure? St. Francis he's in the history books, and people can keep kind of going back to him and borrowing that content and doing increasingly weird and weirder stuff with it, like we are. And I think maybe there's something going on here too, that like liberation theology is cemented in the history books, and now we can kind of go back constantly and rescue it and revive it and keep using it to the detriment of all of the weird conservatives. So I don't know, there's something like that going on here, where just being in the book itself is a promissory note that like it can always return, the eternal return of liberation theology or something. I don't know exactly, but something like that seems right, where just being out there, and then like the Pope being willing enough to play with it and take it back a bit is I think always really empowering.
Yeah, I think so too. There was a comment from Leonardo Boff, kind of early into Francis's papacy, maybe like a year or 2 years, where he was asked, is he a liberation theologian? And Boff's response is basically like, I don't know, who cares? Like, it doesn't really matter. The idea is whether or not he's for liberation, and that's all that liberation theologians ever wanted. And it's actually a cool comment, because Leonardo Boff is, I think, trying to be like, liberation theology is not like a brand, like it's not like something that you market and then you hope that people like sign up to it and it's like a camp that you're in or something like that. Instead, it's like a movement that was trying to make the church a voice for liberation, and he felt like Pope Francis was doing that. So he was like, it doesn't really matter what he calls himself or what people call him. He's fulfilling the kind of dream that liberation theologians had, which was a pope who could speak to those kinds of issues. And I think that is really profound. It kind of reminds me too of we talked about Tisabella Surya's book Planetary Theology a long time ago. Really interesting Sri Lankan theologian, and he also makes this point that like liberation theology, the danger is to like provincialize it, to make it something that only happens in Latin America or only happens in the global South. And the point is to say, well, if it has captured something universal or something of global importance, then the idea is that it should escape that provincialization. And the worst thing for liberation theology would be to turn it into like one school among many schools or something like that. Instead, it should be like part of a, a planetary vision, a kind of universalizing vision. And I feel like that's kind of what you're seeing in a document like this is the raising up of a particular set of concepts and language into just like taken for granted set of concepts and language. And that to me seems like maybe the deeper victory of liberation theology, like not the one that, where the Pope gets out on like the balcony in St. Peter's and is like, guess what? I'm a liberation theologian. But instead, like a Pope who's, willing to like metabolize those concepts and then sort of like put them to work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's a pretty powerful point if you think about Pope Francis and the way that he spoke up in terms of the genocide in Gaza and the way that he, like just reached out to the people of Gaza, like Christians in Gaza. He had phone calls with them constantly. That is a liberation perspective. He wasn't on the balcony talking about socialism or whatever, but that's the work of liberation, is to bring to light situations that are oppressive and part of that big regime of death or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. Glenn Beck was right. He got us the big socialist liberation theology Pope. He did it all. Wow.
That's right. He did it all. Yeah. So I guess toward the end here of our chat about Dilexi Te, I think maybe a final thought is it's cool to hear Pope Francis's voice from the grave one last time and be like, all right, that was a guy who was really trying to do something good for the church. And this was a nice way to like cap it off with a reflection on poverty that really goes to the root of stuff. Bigger than complaints with the US government, but something that can touch on our whole organization of the planet. So that's cool. And I also feel like extremely curious now to find out what is Pope Leo, what is his kind of deal going to be? What's his vision going to be? So nice to hear Francis going out. It will be exciting to figure out what Leo sounds like coming in. So I guess we're still waiting for that, but I'm excited to hear it. What do you think, Matt? Last words on Dilexi Te?
It's a cool one. I like it a lot. And my last words, I'll give up my time because I know that you've got your finger on the stopwatch and you're timing everything I say. I'm going to give up my time in particular, and I'll read the end of Dilexi Te because I think it's great. Christian love breaks down every barrier, brings close those who are distant, unites strangers, and reconciles enemies. It spans chasms that are humanly impossible to bridge, and it penetrates to the most hidden crevices of society. By its very nature, Christian love is prophetic. It works miracles and knows no limits. It makes what was apparently impossible happen. Love is above all a way of looking at life and a way of living it. A church that sets no limits to love, that knows no enemies to fight, but only men and women to love, is the church that the world needs today.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can go buy our book, and then you can read what you heard and many other things called Enough is Enough, Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology, out from Fortress Press on May 12. You can pre-order it now. Tell your friends, tell your library, tell your book club, tell your pastor, your Bible study, your teacher, I don't know, whoever's going to listen. Share that good news. Don't keep it under a bushel, and we'll appreciate that. You can also go get this zine for free on our website. It's Gerard Winstanley. We updated some of the text so it doesn't read like somebody writing hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but reads like I don't know, normal person today explaining a very not normal idea. It's a fun little zine. You can figure out, I don't know, why everything actually belongs to everyone. What else should we say? Oh, and if you support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast, you can get an invite to our Discord where people are reading a wild book about climate change by Wim Carton and Andreas Malm. You can just show up whenever, and people are very nice and willing to help you work through all the hard stuff and the weird stuff and all that. It's a good community over there. You can get into it on our Patreon. Okay, that's it for the ads. Our music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.